Please, close your eyes for just a moment. Take a deep breath. Try to remember the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine on a hot summer evening. Or perhaps remember the comforting sound of your mother calling your name from the balcony as the streetlights began to flicker on. Welcome back to your youth. Welcome back to a time when life felt incredibly pure. Today, we are going to explore 30 forgotten things and everyday rituals from Greece in the 1970s and 1980s. These are the precious golden details of a world that no longer exists outside of our memories. I invite you to stay with me until the very end. We will talk about the most touching sound of all. It was a sound that meant our childhood days were completely safe and wonderfully complete. Let us begin this beautiful journey together. Time simply moved much slower back then. The days felt beautifully long, and the years felt like entire lifetimes. We lived our lives without any rush. We did not have smartphones constantly buzzing in our pockets. We did not have endless television channels to distract us from the present moment. Many people today might look back and think we lived a poorer life because we lacked all this modern technology. They could not be more wrong. Our lives were incredibly wealthy in genuine human connection. Waiting was a respected virtue, not a source of frustration. When you waited for a letter in the mail, or for a fresh loaf of bread to emerge from the bakery oven, the anticipation made the reward so much sweeter. We actually looked each other in the eyes when we spoke. We knocked on our neighbors' doors without calling first. We shared what little we had, and that made us feel wealthier than kings. Our emotions were raw, sincere, and deeply rooted in our community. Let us travel back to those magnificent days and remember how we used to live. Let us begin our journey by stepping into the beloved neighborhood grocery store. This was the traditional bakaliko. In the 1970s, this was not just a place to buy food. It was the beating heart of the community. Do you remember the overwhelming aroma that greeted you at the door? It was an earthy, rich mixture of bulk spices, salted cod, and the sharp scent of fresh feta cheese resting in large wooden barrels of brine. The grocer always wore a crisp white apron. He knew your name, he knew your parents, and he knew exactly how you liked your olives. But the true soul of the bakaliko was the tefteri. This small, worn-out notebook was the ultimate symbol of human trust. There were no plastic credit cards back then. There was only the tefteri. The grocer would carefully write down what your family owed with a pencil. He knew perfectly well that he would be paid at the end of the month when your father received his hard-earned salary. You would walk in as a small child and hand over a handwritten list. The grocer would carefully wrap each item in thick brown paper, tying it with a simple string. There were no barcodes. There was only the rough texture of the paper and the warmth of a neighborly smile. We exchanged pleasantries, shared daily news, and felt like we truly belonged to a tight-knit family. Now, let us remember the absolute magic of the open-air summer cinema. We lovingly called it the Therino. When the intense, suffocating heat of the Greek summer day finally broke, the evening brought a gentle, cooling breeze. You would walk down the lively street, guided by the intoxicating fragrance of honeysuckle climbing over the whitewashed walls of the theatre. Inside, the floor was covered in crushed white gravel. It crunched beautifully and rhythmically under your shoes. You would take your seat on one of those folding canvas director chairs. You could feel the slight chill of the metal frame against your arms. Before the movie even started, the grand ritual of the snacks began. The sound of 100 people cracking roasted pumpkin seeds filled the air like a gentle rain. We called them passatempo, the perfect way to pass the time. You would hold a cold glass bottle of orangeade as the old projector began to loudly whir in the background. The beam of light sliced through the slightly smoky air. It illuminated the bright white screen under a beautiful canopy of stars. Sometimes a stray neighborhood cat would casually walk across the stage. Sometimes the sound of a passing motorcycle would drown out the actors' voices. Nobody minded at all. We were captivated by the silver screen together in the warm night air. Let us travel back to those scorching summer afternoons when the streets were perfectly quiet. The adults were resting, taking their mandatory midday nap behind closed shutters. Suddenly, the heavy silence was broken by the sharp, metallic ringing of a small bell. It was the Pagatatsis. He was the neighborhood ice cream vendor, riding his heavy white tricycle slowly down the street. The moment that bell echoed through the alleyways, a wave of pure adrenaline hit every child in the vicinity. We would scramble frantically to find a few drachma coins. We checked our pockets and begged our sleepy parents before rushing out the door. The tricycle had a large, heavy insulated box on the front. When the vendor opened the thick lid, a magical cloud of freezing white vapor escaped into the hot summer air. Inside lay the true treasures of our youth. They were neatly wrapped blocks of ice cream. Do you remember the simple, profound joy of peeling back the paper wrapper of a classic vanilla and chocolate stick? We always looked at the wooden stick afterward, hoping to see the magical words that meant we had won a free ice cream. The vendor would hand you your frozen prize with a wide, genuine smile. We had to wait for him to bring the joy to our doorstep. It made every single bite taste like a hard-earned victory against the heat. Let us move to the heart of the Greek Sunday tradition. In the 1970s, many houses did not have large, powerful ovens. Or perhaps, families simply wanted to save on electricity. So, the local neighborhood bakery became our communal kitchen. We called it the forno. Early on Sunday morning, our mothers and grandmothers would prepare the traditional family meal. It was usually a large, round aluminum roasting pan filled with generous cuts of lamb, potatoes, garlic, oregano, and freshly squeezed lemons. As a child, you were often tasked with carefully carrying this heavy, raw masterpiece down the street to the baker. The bakery smelled incredibly rich. It was a glorious mixture of fresh sourdough bread and the savory aromas of 20 different family meals cooking simultaneously in the massive wood-fired oven. The baker knew exactly which pan belonged to which family without ever needing to use any name tags. At exactly 1:00 in the afternoon, you would make the careful journey back home. You carried the steaming hot pan, wrapping the handles in old newspapers to protect your hands from burning. The smell wafting from that pan as you walked home was sheer torture for a hungry child. That roasted meat brought the whole family together around the Sunday table. It was a ritual of absolute trust. As the gentle warmth of autumn faded and the winter chill began to creep into our uninsulated homes, a very specific seasonal ritual took place. It was time to bring out the heavy flocati rugs. These magnificent thick woolen rugs were the absolute pride of the Greek household. Before they were laid out on the cold terrazzo floors, they had to be thoroughly washed. Do you recall the immense physical effort this required? Entire families would gather in the courtyard to scrub the thick wool. We used large, rough blocks of green olive oil soap. The smell of that pure, earthy soap mixed with wet sheep wool is entirely unforgettable. We would stomp on the heavy rugs barefoot in large metal tubs. The cold water splashed our legs, turning a massive chore into a playful, joyful event. Once they were finally clean and dried over sturdy wooden fences, they completely transformed the living room. Walking barefoot on a freshly washed, fluffy flocati was like stepping onto a warm, welcoming cloud. We would sit directly on the rug, playing board games or watching the single channel on our black and white television. We felt utterly protected from the freezing wind outside. They were not just floor decorations. They were thick, woolly shields that kept the family warm and closely knit together during the long winter nights. Let us talk about a beautiful gesture of hospitality that seems almost entirely forgotten today. When guests arrived at a Greek home on a blistering hot afternoon, they were not immediately offered fancy store-bought cookies. Instead, the hostess would bring out a beautiful silver tray. It carried tall glasses of freezing cold water. Inside each glass rested a silver spoon plunged into a generous scoop of sweet, sticky mastic resin. This was the famous submarine sweet, or ipovritio. Do you remember the delicate, patient ritual of eating it? You would take the spoon out of the chilled water and gently bite off a small piece of the chewy fondant. Then, you would place the spoon back into the glass. The sweet resin would slowly flavor the water, leaving a subtle, refreshing pine aroma. The delicate clinking sound of the spoon hitting the side of the glass was the wonderful soundtrack of polite afternoon conversation. It was a deeply elegant, simple treat that absolutely required patience. You could not rush eating a submarine sweet. You had to sit, listen to the adults talk about relatives, and slowly savor the cool, sugary texture. It represented a beautiful era where guests were honored with whatever modest, beautiful things a household could offer. Now, let us listen to the rhythmic, lively sounds of the traditional local coffee house. This was the cafeneio. It served as the unofficial parliament of the neighborhood. This was exclusively a domain for the older men. It was a sanctuary of strong tobacco smoke, worn-out wooden chairs with woven rush seats, and endless, loud political debates. The undeniable heartbeat of this place was the sharp, aggressive clack of the dice. We listened to the slamming of wooden pieces on the backgammon board, which we called tavli. It was not just a simple game here. It was a fierce battle of wits, pride, and luck. You would walk past the open doors and instantly smell the intense aroma of Greek coffee. It was being slowly boiled in a small copper pot, resting deeply inside a bed of hot sand. The men would sit for hours, nursing a single small cup of coffee. They read the daily newspaper and twirled their amber worry beads. The beads clicked endlessly and rhythmically through their fingers. The cafeneio was a place of true, unfiltered connection. Grievances were aired, old jokes were shared, and time simply stood still. These men did not need internet connections to stay informed. They simply walked down to the corner, took a seat, ordered a coffee, and let the pulse of the neighborhood wash over them. If there is one specific visual that perfectly captures the essence of a Greek courtyard in the 1970s, it is the brilliant recycling of large tin cans. When a massive metal container of feta cheese was finally emptied, it was never thrown away. That would be an unthinkable waste. Instead, our mothers and grandmothers would carefully wash it out. They poked drainage holes in the bottom with a large nail. Then, they painted the cans in bright, vibrant shades of green, red, or deep blue. These humble metal tins became the proud homes for massive, bushy basil plants. Do you remember walking onto a balcony as the sun began to set? The intense heat of the day would start to fade. The women would come out with a green plastic watering can to lovingly refresh the plants. As the cool water hit the dry soil, their hands gently brushed against the bright green leaves. Instantly, the most intoxicating, peppery scent of fresh basil would fill the evening air. We planted mint, geraniums, and carnations in these tins. We created magnificent hanging gardens out of absolute necessity and thrift. It was a beautiful testament to the resilience and immense creativity of our people. They took a simple piece of commercial trash and transformed it into a vessel for life. Let us take a quiet moment to remember the sheer physical weight of our old currency. I am talking about the beautiful drachma coins. In the 1970s and 1980s, money felt incredibly real and wonderfully substantial in your hands. Do you recall the heavy silver-colored 20 drachma coin? It featured the stoic face of Pericles. Or perhaps you remember the beloved older coins featuring the owl of Athena. Holding a pocket full of drachmas meant you held a world of small, exciting possibilities. You would walk down the bustling streets of Athens or Thessaloniki. You could hear the satisfying sound of the heavy coins jingling against each other in your pocket. You would follow the delicious scent of toasted sesame seeds in the morning air. For just a few drachmas, you could buy a fresh, warm bread ring from a street vendor. He carried a massive circular wooden tray covered in these treats. The vendor would carefully select the softest, most perfectly baked ring for you. He wrapped it in a tiny piece of thin, crinkling paper. The loud crunch of the sesame seeds and the exchange of those heavy, beautiful coins was a daily morning ritual. Money today is just a digital number on a silent plastic screen. But back then, the drachma connected us to our ancient history. As evening fell over the country, especially in the villages and smaller provincial towns, the entire community engaged in a beautiful social choreography. This was known as the volta. The local square, the platea, became the grand open stage of our lives. After a long week of hard work, people would put on their absolute best clothes. Young men wore crisp, ironed shirts. Young women wore their favourite colourful Sunday dresses. The volta was a slow, highly deliberate promenade back and forth across the square. It was the primary way for the youth to see and be seen. It was a crucial, unspoken ritual for romance long before the era of social media. You would walk arm in arm with your best friends. Your heart would beat wildly as you approached the group of people you secretly admired. There were subtle glances, very shy smiles, and secret messages passed through brief, intense eye contact. Parents and grandparents sat at the perimeter at the tavernas. They sipped ouzo and kept a watchful, loving eye on the proceedings. The evening air was filled with the warm murmur of 100 overlapping conversations. You could smell the incredible scent of roasted meats from the corner souvlaki stands. It was an entire society deciding to step outside and breathe the evening air together. Now, let us recall the central piece of technology in the house. It was the heavy, black rotary telephone provided by the National Telecommunications Company. In the 1970s, having a telephone installed was a major life event. It could take months or even years of waiting on a list. Once it finally arrived, it sat proudly on a small, dedicated lace doily in the hallway. It was treated almost like a sacred artifact. Do you remember the immense physical effort of dialing a number? You had to place your finger in the small circular hole. You pulled the heavy rotary dial all the way to the metal stop. Then, you listened to that deeply satisfying, mechanical whirring sound as it returned to its original position. Many households even placed a small brass padlock through the dial. This prevented children from making expensive long-distance calls. Often, entire neighborhoods shared what was called a party line. You would pick up the heavy receiver and hear your neighbor discussing their dinner plans. You had to politely clear your throat and ask them to hang up so you could make a call. We memorized the phone numbers of all our loved ones. A phone call was a deliberate, expensive action. You stood in the hallway holding that heavy plastic receiver, truly focusing on the voice at the other end. Let us journey back to the noisy schoolyards of the 1970s and early 1980s. Every single morning, a massive sea of blue flooded the streets as children made their way to school. I am talking about the classic blue school uniform. We called it the podia. Whether you were rich or poor, you wore the exact same dark blue smock with a crisp, detachable white collar. Do you remember the strict Sunday evening ritual? Your mother would meticulously wash, starch, and iron that uniform. The heavy cotton fabric had to be perfectly pressed. The white collar had to shine like fresh snow. The boys wore their collars pinned tightly. The girls often had beautiful, delicate white lace borders. This uniform was so much more than just a piece of clothing. It was a great, silent equalizer. In the classroom, all social classes completely disappeared beneath that blue fabric. You were judged by your character, your innocent mischief, and your handwriting, not by the brands of clothes your parents could afford. When we ran into the schoolyard, dropping our heavy leather satchels to play, the blue uniforms would fly around in the wind. When they were finally abolished, we gained freedom of expression, but we lost a profound, unspoken sense of unity and shared identity. Before the sun even thought about rising, when the streets were bathed in the cold, blue light of dawn, a very specific sound announced the new day. It was the gentle, rhythmic clinking of glass bottles hitting against metal wire crates. This was the neighborhood milkman making his early rounds. In an era long before massive plastic jugs and milk that last for months on a shelf, milk was a daily, fresh delivery. The milkman would leave heavy glass bottles of fresh milk right at your doorstep. He carefully collected the empty bottles from the day before. Do you remember the small aluminum tokens we used to pay him? We would leave a few colored tokens inside the empty bottles as our silent currency. Once you brought the cold milk inside the house, the most crucial daily ritual began. You had to immediately boil the milk in a special aluminum pot to make it safe to drink. The sweet, comforting smell of boiling milk would slowly fill the entire kitchen. You had to watch the pot incredibly closely. If you looked away for a second, the milk would foam up and spill everywhere. But if you managed it perfectly, a thick, delicious skin of fresh cream would form on top. Our mothers would carefully skim this cream off to make rich homemade butter. It was a time of deep respect for our food. Let us press play on the magnificent soundtrack of our youth. Before the pristine, skip-free audio of digital streaming services, music was a deeply physical, fragile thing. We lived in the golden, dusty era of the cassette tape. Do you remember the intense frustration and ultimate triumph of a tangled tape? When the cheap cassette player in the kitchen would suddenly chew up your favorite album, you had to act like a surgeon. You gently pulled the delicate brown ribbon out. You inserted a hexagonal pencil into the plastic spool and meticulously twisted it to win the tape back into place. And what were we listening to? We listened to the raw, unfiltered emotion of traditional music, the heavy, sorrowful voice of Stelios Kazantzidis singing about poverty and migration poured out of those tiny, crackling speakers. We would sit on the balcony with a small portable radio. We extended the antenna as far as it would go to catch a clear signal from a pirate radio station. The slightly muffled sound, accompanied by the underlying hiss of the magnetic tape, gave the music a unique texture. We created mixed tapes for the people we deeply loved. We spent hours waiting by the radio to hit record at the exact moment a song started. We captured a piece of our hearts on a small plastic rectangle. As the brutal cold of winter set in, the geography of the Greek home completely shifted. Entire rooms were abandoned due to the chill. Family life contracted to a single, warm epicenter. This was the room that housed the kerosene or wood-burning stove. We called it the somba. Do you remember the distinct, sharp smell of the kerosene being poured into the metal tank? It was a scent that instantly signaled the arrival of deep winter. Lighting the stove was strictly an adult job. Once the flame finally caught, you could look through the small glass window and watch the hypnotic, bright orange glow. The stove was not just a simple heater, it was the absolute soul of the living room. Our mothers would place a small metal bowl of water on top to keep the air from getting too dry. Sometimes they threw in a few dried orange peels. These peels would slowly release a sweet, gorgeous citrus aroma into the hot air. In the evenings, we would sit as close to the heated metal as we possibly could. We placed fresh chestnuts directly on the flat top of the stove. We waited for the hard shells to blacken and crack open. We dried our wet woolen socks on wooden chairs placed around the fire. We bonded deeply in its radiant, comforting and essential heat. Let us open the front door and run outside to the lively streets of our childhood. In the 1970s, the streets did not belong to parked cars. They belonged entirely to us, the children. The absolute moment your homework was finished, you dashed outside to join the loud, chaotic gang of neighborhood kids. There was no need to arrange formal play dates. You simply followed the loud sound of screaming and laughing. Do you remember the endless, thrilling games of hide and seek? We played in the dark corners of narrow alleys. We played intense matches of dodgeball, where the only goal was to catch the ball and bravely save your teammate. We played until we were completely covered in dust, sweat, and dirt. Our knees were permanently bruised and terribly scraped. They were constantly painted bright red with mercurochrome. This was the stinging red liquid our mothers generously applied to every single cut. We possessed an incredible, unstructured freedom. There were no cell phones to constantly track our locations. Our boundaries were defined by the sound of our mothers' voices and the flickering street lights. We negotiated our own rules. We fought, we made up, and we learned how to be resilient human beings on those uneven sidewalks. Let us gently open the heavy carved wooden chests that sat quietly in the bedrooms of our grandmothers. Inside these dark chests, carefully folded and smelling beautifully of dried lavender, lay the traditional dowry. We called it the troika. This was not just a simple collection of household linens. It was a physical, heavy manifestation of a mother's profound love and bright hope for her daughter's future. From the very moment a baby girl was born, the older women of the family would begin working. They meticulously embroidered sheets, tablecloths, and soft towels. Do you remember watching your grandmother sitting near the window to catch the fading afternoon light? Her needle moved rhythmically through the white cotton fabric. She would spend months completing a single intricate cross-stitch pattern. She created delicate, stunning lace edges with a small crochet hook. Every single tiny stitch was a silent prayer for a happy marriage and a prosperous home. When a young woman was finally ready to be married, the dowry was proudly displayed for the entire neighborhood to admire. Today, we buy cheap, mass-produced linens that wear out in a year. But those dowry pieces were heavy and durable. They were heirlooms meant to outlast the very people who lovingly created them. Let us step outside on a blazing summer afternoon, right around 5 o'clock. The brutal, punishing sun finally began to lower its gaze. This was the time for a deeply ingrained, almost sacred daily ritual. The women of the neighborhood would emerge from their homes. They held long green plastic hoses or heavy metal buckets of water. They carried stiff, bristled brooms. It was time to aggressively wash the sidewalk and the street in front of the house. Do you remember the incredibly specific, earthy smell that rose into the air? It happened the exact moment the cold water hit the scorching hot asphalt. It was a magical scent that instantly signaled the end of the working day. The women would sweep away the thick dust of the day, washing the pavement until it was perfectly clean. But this was never just about basic cleanliness. It was the highly anticipated daily social hour. Leaning casually on their brooms, neighbors would chat over low brick walls. They exchanged local gossip, shared cooking recipes, and loudly discussed the daily news. The wet pavement would cool the hot air significantly. This set the perfect stage for the evening. Families would soon bring out their wooden chairs to sit on the freshly washed sidewalk, eating thick slices of cold watermelon. Let us recall the most essential, defining scent of a Greek summer night. When the sun finally disappeared, you were sitting quietly on the balcony, enjoying the cool evening breeze. Suddenly, a tiny, annoying buzzing sound would inevitably approach your ear. The mosquitoes had arrived. Before we had plug-in liquid repellents and electronic zappers, our main line of defense was incredibly simple. We used the humble green mosquito coils. We called them fidakia. Do you remember carefully opening the thin cardboard box? You had to try to separate the two tightly intertwined coils without snapping them in half. It absolutely required the steady, patient hands of a surgeon. Once successfully separated, you would place the coil on a tiny, flimsy metal stand. You lit the tip with a wooden match. You blew out the small flame, leaving a glowing red ember. It slowly consumed the green spiral. The thick, white smoke that curled upward carried a distinct, powdery, slightly chemical scent. It was deeply comforting. That specific smell meant summer had truly arrived. It meant long nights sitting on the veranda with your family. You listened to the cicadas slowly quiet down. The coil would burn for hours, leaving behind a long trail of perfectly shaped grey ash. And finally, let us return to the most powerful, emotional sound of our childhood. It was the ultimate signal that our day of grand adventures had come to a close. You are playing wildly in the street with your best friends. The streetlights have just flickered on. They cast long yellow shadows on the warm pavement. You are completely lost in the game. You actively ignore the growing darkness. Then, cutting sharply through the noise of children playing, you hear it. Your mother's voice echoes loudly from the balcony on the second floor. She calls your name. She stretches out the vowels, telling you that dinner is finally ready. It is time to come upstairs. Do you remember the sudden, heavy feeling of having to leave your friends? You would negotiate desperately for just 5 more minutes. But her voice was the absolute law of the neighborhood. You would walk up those cool marble stairs with very tired legs. Your clothes smelled intensely of street dust and sweat. You knew deeply that you were returning to a safe haven. You would walk through the front door to the wonderful smell of freshly fried potatoes. That voice calling from the balcony was not just a dinner bell. It was the beautiful sound of someone watching over you. It was an invisible tether of unconditional love. It pulled us safely back from the wild streets into the absolute warmth of our homes. When we look back at these 30 wonderful memories, we realize something deeply profound. We do not just miss the heavy drachma coins, the blue school uniforms, or the open-air cinemas. We desperately miss the people we were back then. We miss the slow, deliberate, and beautiful pace of our youth. We miss a time when our neighborhoods felt like one massive, extended family. We miss the comforting feeling that we had all the time in the world to simply exist. Thank you for taking this beautiful, emotional journey down memory lane with me today. If this video brought a warm, nostalgic smile to your face, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly means the world to us and helps us keep these memories alive. Now, I have a very important question for you. Which of these forgotten rituals made you feel the most nostalgic today? Or perhaps you have a very special memory of your own, from the 1970s or 1980s in Greece. Please share your personal, beautiful story in the comments below. I promise you, I read every single one of them. Until next time, keep your memories close to your heart.